Tonight you're invited on a journey, not by road or air, but by a quiet train that winds through the corners of dreams and memory. A train that only runs when the world is still and waiting. So take a deep breath, and let's begin. It was nearing twilight when Clara stepped onto the platform of Windermere Station, her suitcase in hand wrapped in a woolen coat that had seen many winters. The sun was melting behind the trees, casting long amber shadows on the old stone tiles beneath her boots. Windermere Station wasn't large, just one long platform, a quiet ticket booth closed for the night, and a flickering lantern above the sign that read, Evening Hollow Line, last departure 8:04 p.m. Clara looked down at her ticket once more. The paper was soft, a little yellowed at the edges with curling ink that read in looping cursive. One way, Windermere to Evening Hollow. There was no departure date, no seat number. Only a message written faintly at the bottom. You'll know when it's time. She'd found the ticket inside a book she hadn't opened in years, tucked between pages about sea journeys and summer winds. It was her grandmother's favorite novel, and Clara had reached for it without knowing why. Something about that evening had felt paused, like the air itself was waiting. Now standing on the platform with mist curling around her ankles, she began to wonder whether the ticket was part of a memory, or a dream, or something else entirely. The sound came slowly at first, a hum, almost like the low purr of a cello string. Then a distant chime. The rails began to tremble ever so gently, and out of the trees rolled a train. Not loud, not fast, but certain. Its engine was round and silver, like moonlight poured into metal. The cars behind it stretched farther than Clara could count, each window aglow with golden warmth. There was no smoke, only a shimmer above it, like heat rising off pavement on a summer's day. The train slowed to a stop. One door opened. The conductor stood there smiling with eyes that looked like they'd seen everything and forgotten nothing. Evening Hollow, Clara asked, though the question felt unnecessary. He nodded, tipping his cap. Final stop before dreams, he said. May I take your case? She handed it over, stepping into the soft light of the car. The floor was polished wood, worn in all the best places. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. There were no other passengers in sight, only rows of velvet seats and windows that framed the darkening forest outside. She settled into a window seat, her coat folded beside her as the train gave a gentle lurch and began to glide forward. Outside, the trees leaned toward the tracks as if to whisper. The stars had begun to appear one by one, like lanterns hung by invisible hands. The moon, thin and curious, followed the train like a silver kite. Clara leaned her head against the glass. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels beneath her began to match her breath. She noticed her shoulders relax. Her hands rested open and calm in her lap. There was something about the train, something more than just motion. It felt like it knew the way not only through forest and field, but through memory and heart. She wondered where the tracks truly led. After a time, the conductor passed through the car. He moved with the ease of someone unhurried by time, his coat brushing gently against the velvet seats. Would you like a cup of dream root tea? He asked softly. She blinked. Is that real? He smiled. Everything is. Here at least. He handed her a porcelain cup, warm to the touch. The tea inside shimmered pale blue, and the steam smelled of chamomile mint, and something Clara couldn't name, a scent like rain on stone. She sipped, and with it memories stirred. She saw herself as a child, chasing fireflies in her grandmother's garden. The warmth of midsummer air wrapped around her as she ran barefoot, the grass dewy and soft. Her grandmother had sat on the porch, humming a tune too old to have a name. The train passed a field now, and for a moment Clara could swear she saw fireflies hovering over it, tiny sparks of gold dancing through the dark. Each of us brings something aboard, the conductor said gently. Pieces, echoes. He tipped his cap and continued down the aisle. Clara let her eyes drift closed. She woke to soft bells. The train was slowing again just slightly as it passed a wide lake. The water was still reflecting the stars above with eerie perfection. The train's reflection moved with it, gliding like a phantom across the surface. Clara leaned closer to the glass and saw something strange. In the water's mirror, another version of herself sat just as she did now, but older, her hair longer, her eyes calmer. This Clara smiled gently, then lifted a hand and waved. Clara hesitated, then raised her hand too. The reflection nodded once and disappeared as the train rounded a bend. She sat back in wonder, the warmth of the tea still humming in her chest. Sometime later, the forest gave way to meadows touched by mist. The train didn't stop, but Clara saw lights in the distance, tiny cabins, lanterns swaying on porches, people gathered by fires with mugs in their hands and music in the air. The world seemed painted in brushstrokes of memory, soft and unfinished. A fox trotted alongside the train for a few minutes, keeping pace with surprising grace. It glanced at Clara, eyes glowing in the dark, then vanished into the tall grass. A woman's voice echoed softly through the car, not spoken but sung, not loud but close. She turned. There was a harpist seated in the far corner of the carriage now, though Clara hadn't seen her enter. The woman played with fingers so light they barely seemed to touch the strings. The melody was familiar in the way dreams often are half remembered, fully felt. Clara closed her eyes. She dreamed of staircases that spiraled into the sky, of gardens that bloomed beneath snow, of pages in a book that turned themselves, of a train that could follow the shape of a wish. She dreamed of a small room tucked beneath the eaves of an old house, where moonlight pooled on the floor and time never knocked. She dreamed of Evening Hollow. Though she had never been, she knew the place. When she woke, the stars had shifted. The conductor sat across from her, now watching the night pass. "How long until we arrive?" she asked, her voice still laced with sleep. He didn't check a watch. "When the story ends," he said simply, "not a minute sooner." She nodded. Outside, the land had changed again. Gentle hills now rolled beside the tracks, and from their crests stood old trees with branches like open arms. Owls blinked slowly from the shadows. A soft fog curled in pockets along the earth, silver in the moonlight. Clara reached into her coat pocket and found something she hadn't placed there, a photograph. Worn edges, a black and white image of her as a young girl standing beside her grandmother in front of the Windmere station. She hadn't remembered the photo being taken. On the back in faint pencil were the words, "You're already on your way." She traced the handwriting with her thumb heart blooming with something like comfort. The train passed beneath a wide arch of trees. Beyond them, lights twinkled in the distance. Not harsh, not bright, but welcoming. A bell chimed again. The conductor rose. "Evening Hollow ahead," he said softly. Clara sat up, her heart steady. The tea was gone, the harpist too, but her warmth remained. Outside the station came into view. It wasn't large, just a platform lit by hanging lanterns, and beyond it a winding path that disappeared into woods touched by moonlight. A sign above the station door swayed in the breeze. "Evening Hollow, rest easy." The train slowed, stopped. One door opened. Clara stood gathering her coat. The conductor handed her the suitcase, which now felt lighter than before. As she stepped down onto the platform, the cool night air wrapped around her like a promise. She looked back once. The train stood quiet, steam curling like breath. The conductor tipped his cap. Then, without a sound, the train began to pull away, disappearing into the darkness from which it came. Clara turned toward the path ahead, and with a peaceful breath, she walked forward into the gentle glow of Evening Hollow. We hope your journey tonight brought a bit of stillness, a soft place to land. Sleep well, traveler. The next part of the journey awaits. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels was now a lullaby in itself. Each turn of the track hummed like a soft breath, and the stars outside the windows blinked slowly as if watching over the passengers. The gentle glow of the lanterns in the corridor bathed everything in a warm amber hue. Miles sat quietly in his velvet seat, the soft fabric beneath him cradling his weight. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, creating silver patches on the polished floor. He leaned back, breathing deeply. There was no rush, no schedule, just the unhurried journey through this strange and beautiful night. After some time, the conductor returned not with another ticket or clipboard, but with 2 steaming cups of herbal tea on a small silver tray. "Chamomile and stardust," the conductor said softly, setting one of the cups beside Miles. "For the nerves and the dreams." Miles accepted it gratefully, the ceramic warm against his fingers. He took a sip. The taste was light and floral, with something else beneath it, like the memory of a dream he hadn't quite had yet. After a moment, the conductor gestured down the corridor. "You might want to stretch your legs. Some of the other cars have things worth seeing. The train adapts to its passengers, you know." With a slight nod and a sleepy smile, Miles stood and wandered into the next car. This one was unlike anything he had expected. It was filled wall to wall with maps. The room stretched impossibly wide and tall, its walls layered in ancient parchments, delicate scrolls, star charts, and navigational diagrams that pulsed faintly with a soft blue light. Some maps were tacked gently to the ceiling, fluttering in a breeze that didn't exist. Others hung in golden frames or hovered slightly off the wall, rotating slowly to reveal other lands and times. Miles walked slowly down the aisle between the hanging maps. One showed a coastline shaped like a crescent moon surrounded by floating isles. Another was a map of the sky, but not the sky he knew. The constellations were different. One formed a sleeping cat, another a lighthouse with a blinking star at its top. A man sat quietly at a long wooden table in the center of the room, a fountain pen in hand, inked fingers brushing across the parchment. He looked up and smiled, eyes twinkling. Looking for somewhere in particular, the man asked, his voice as quiet as the turning pages of a book. Miles hesitated. "I'm not sure." "Well," the man said kindly, "that's often the best place to start." He gestured toward a corner of the car where a map glowed softly, unlike the others. It pulsed with a golden light like it was waiting. "That one hasn't been drawn yet," the mapmaker said. "It waits for someone to dream it." Miles walked closer, and as he did, the outlines of the land began to shimmer into view. Rolling hills, soft rivers, quiet forests. The name Evening Hollow appeared in curling script at the bottom corner. His heart gave a gentle leap. "This is where we're going," Miles said softly. The mapmaker nodded. "That's right, and what happens there will be shaped in part by you." Miles stepped back, watching the map continue to draw itself. A path began to wind through the hills, and near its edge a small cottage appeared, smoke curling from the chimney. Something about it made him feel a warm tug of recognition, though he couldn't place why. He turned to the mapmaker. "Do all the passengers see this car?" The man chuckled. "Only the ones who are wondering where they've been, or where they're meant to go." Miles sipped the last of his tea, which had cooled slightly, but still tasted of stars and flowers. The map before him shimmered again, and in a blink a tiny figure appeared on the path, a man in a long coat with a leather satchel walking toward the cottage. It was him. He watched for a long while before continuing on. The next car was quieter still. It smelled of paper and lavender. Inside were shelves upon shelves of journals, each one neatly labeled in fine handwriting. A woman with silver-streaked hair and a soft cardigan stood atop a rolling ladder, tucking one of the books back into place. She turned, smiling. "You must be Miles," she said kindly. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." He blinked in surprise. "You know me." In a manner of speaking, she replied. "These are dream journals, ones that were never written down, but still remembered." She pulled a volume from the shelf and handed it to him. The cover bore no title, but as he opened it, the pages inside began to fill slowly in the same handwriting as the label on the spine. He read, "A train glides through the quiet night beneath a sky that knows your name. You sip tea made of dreams and stars while outside the world folds into wonder." He looked up at her. "But I'm reading this right now." She smiled. "Yes, you're remembering it as you go." Miles turned the page. The next lines weren't written yet, but as he stood there, they began to form. The script was soft curling, almost as though the book were dreaming too. He closed the journal gently and held it against his chest. "May I keep this?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "But remember, it'll keep writing itself as long as you're open to the wonder." Back in the corridor, the train gently rocked side to side, cradling its passengers. A clock on the wall ticked backwards, its hands spinning slowly in reverse. Time on this train did not move the same way. Miles returned to his seat for a while, cradling the dream journal in his lap. The car was nearly empty now, the other passengers having wandered into other cars of their own. He imagined what they were seeing: a garden of sleeping flowers, a room where music played from floating lanterns, a car full of lost lullabies. He rested his head against the velvet cushion, and the hum of the train pulled at his eyelids. Just as he began to doze, a soft chime echoed through the train. Ding! Then a voice soft and steady. "Next stop, the glade of forgotten sounds. Please prepare to remember what you thought you'd lost." Miles opened his eyes, smiling softly. Of course, even the forgotten had their place here. He stood again, stepping into the next car. This one was dark and filled with soft tones, a gentle cello, the flutter of wind chimes, the distant laughter of someone from childhood. The air shimmered and sound took on shapes like fog or silk or drifting threads of light. A soft voice welcomed him. This is where the sounds go when they are no longer heard. A woman with glowing eyes and robes that flowed like water stood nearby, holding a delicate harp that shimmered with every movement. Miles wandered through the car. As he passed certain corners, memories returned not visually, but through sound. The train slid quietly through a canopy of misty firs, their tall spires silhouetted against a pearlescent sky. Sylvie leaned against the window, her fingers curled around a warm cup of spiced cocoa that had somehow arrived without her noticing. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla clung to the steam rising softly into the air, like a lullaby in vapor form. Across from her, Theo was reading a book, or at least pretending to. His eyes weren't on the pages, but drifting toward the distant hills as they slipped past. The quiet between them was not emptiness, but fullness, like the hush between notes in a well-loved song. The conductor's voice came gently over the intercom, like someone speaking from the other end of a long dream. "Next stop, the Garden of Stillness. Please gather your thoughts, but not too tightly." Sylvie raised an eyebrow. "Gather your thoughts." Theo smiled. "This place doesn't like cluttered minds. It's meant for resting the parts of you that never get to rest." The train began to slow. There was no screech, no jolt, just a soft sigh of motion winding down. When the doors slid open, a cool breeze rolled in, carrying the scent of rain on stone, and something faintly floral, like night-blooming jasmine mixed with memory. Sylvie and Theo stepped out into what looked like an ancient garden, tucked between gently sloping hills. Pathways wound between groves of sleeping willows and silvery ponds that reflected not the sky above, but what looked like past moments, frozen in soft motion. In one pond, a girl chased fireflies with laughter trailing behind her like stardust. In another, an old man rested in a rocking chair, a book open on his chest, his eyes closed in perfect peace. "These aren't just ponds," Sylvie whispered. "They're memories." Theo nodded, "ones that still hold warmth." They walked slowly along the winding stone path. The garden wasn't large, but time behaved differently here. Each turn seemed to stretch gently, encouraging you to linger. In the center stood an ornate gazebo, with vines curling up its columns, woven with soft blue lanterns that pulsed like fireflies breathing in the dusk. Inside the gazebo sat a woman. Her hair was streaked with silver, and her shawl was woven with constellations that shimmered as she moved. "Welcome," she said, her voice like the hush of waves retreating from a shore. "You've brought your weariness with you. That's good. Only what's tired can be healed." Theo bowed gently and Sylvie gave a curious nod. The woman gestured toward a bench. "Please sit, and tell me what has followed you." They sat, and the air around them deepened, not darker, just quieter. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath for your story. Sylvie hesitated, then began. Sometimes I feel like I'm never fully awake or fully asleep, like I'm somewhere in between all the time, half in dreams, half in errands, like my soul is jet-lagged from living." The woman nodded gently. "Many who come here feel that way. Time stretches, responsibilities pull, and the space to simply be becomes thin." Theo added, "It's like forgetting how to rest even when you lie down." The woman reached into a pouch beside her and pulled out a single key, small brass and warm-looking. "This is a key to stillness, but only within. The garden helps you find the door, but you must open it." Sylvie took the key. It tingled in her palm like it had a slow heartbeat of its own. They rose, and the woman led them along a hidden path beneath a trellis of trailing vines. As they walked, the air grew even softer, the colors around them muted in a way that felt like velvet for the eyes. Soon, they arrived at a circle of standing stones, each one carved with swirling symbols that looked like they were always on the edge of becoming letters. In the center was a low stone table, and upon it a mirror. But when Sylvie looked into it, she didn't see her reflection. She saw herself sleeping, not just in bed, but truly resting. A version of herself with unknotted shoulders, unclenched hands, and a quiet mind. The mirror shimmered, then faded to stillness. "This said, the woman is what waits for you when you give permission to pause." Sylvie's throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she missed herself, not the version that met deadlines and scheduled meetings, but the one who sat by windows and watched raindrops race. The woman stepped back and said no more. Instead, the garden began to hum, a barely audible vibration like a distant lullaby being played on the strings of moonlight. Sylvie stood at the center of the stone circle and closed her eyes. The key in her hand warmed. And then something strange but gentle began to happen. She didn't fall asleep. She simply stilled. The kind of stillness that lets your breath find its natural rhythm again. The kind that releases the grip of thought. She wasn't thinking or dreaming, just being. And in that space, something deep and ancient within her finally exhaled. Time became vast and kind. When she opened her eyes again, the garden looked different, not in form, but in feeling. Everything pulsed with quiet gratitude. The willows bowed slightly, the lanterns glowed a bit brighter, and the paths looked like they led not away, but inward. Theo took her hand. "You found it," he whispered. Sylvie nodded. "I want to remember this, even when we leave." "You will," said the woman, now standing at the garden's edge. "Because once you know stillness, it becomes a place you can return to, even on the busiest of days." The train's soft whistle echoed in the distance, a melodic chime more than a call. It was time to board again. As they walked back, Sylvie turned one last time. The garden of stillness stood quietly, but something in its presence promised return. Not in steps or miles, but in breath. In remembering. They stepped back onto the train. The door closed with a sigh, and the carriage began to glide forward once more. As the garden faded behind them, Sylvie tucked the key into her pocket, not to use again, but to remind her she didn't need to search anymore. Stillness wasn't a place on a map. It was something you carried inside. The train rolled on ever so gently, like it was gliding across a sea of clouds. Beyond the windows, the forest had melted into a soft blur of lavender and blue, and the hills had given way to wide meadows, glowing under a night sky threaded with stars. Tessa and Bram had drifted into a kind of waking dream. Time no longer felt like it was ticking forward. It had stretched, softened, and settled into the gentle rhythm of the train's heartbeat. Then a bell chimed. Once, twice, then 3 soft notes. A new station. Tessa leaned forward, squinting through the glass. A sign emerged from the mist as the train slowed to a quiet stop. Sonare Hollow, the station of forgotten songs. The air outside shimmered slightly, like it was vibrating with sound you couldn't quite hear. As they stepped onto the platform, the world seemed different, quieter, but not empty. Instead, it was full of things unsaid, melodies unplayed. A winding path of cobblestones led from the station, and instead of buildings, There were glowing glass domes scattered through a field of soft grass. Each dome pulsed with light, some bright and steady, others faint and flickering. "What are they?" Tessa whispered. "A memory of a song," Bram said, as if he'd remembered something long buried. "This place, it collects melodies that were lost lullabies, forgotten tunes, never finished songs, never sung." They followed a curved trail toward the nearest dome. As they approached it, shimmered and brightened. Inside, floating in the air like a ribbon, was a delicate tune it wove through the space, invisible but present like mist curling in sunlight. Tessa closed her eyes, and she heard it. A music box, gentle and slow. A melody that echoed something from childhood, perhaps her grandmother humming softly while baking, or the wind outside her window during the quietest hour of the night. The sound wasn't loud. It was soft, like memory itself, half there, half imagined. And yet it wrapped around her like a blanket. Bram stepped inside the dome and began to hum along, his voice light as air. "That's the thing," he said. "They come back to you. Even if you didn't know you'd forgotten them." They moved from dome to dome. Each one held a unique melody. One was the whistle of a tea kettle that had been turned into a lullaby. Another held a child's nonsense song, joyful and bouncing with laughter. One dome held only the sound of a cello playing a slow descending scale that seemed to mirror a falling leaf. Tessa wandered deeper into the field. In the farthest dome, nearly hidden beneath the arching branches of a willow tree, she found a melody that made her pause. It was hers. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. It wasn't something she had ever written or played aloud, but the tune belonged to her, woven from the quiet moments she'd spent walking alone in the early morning, from the dreams that never had words, from the pages of notebooks she never showed anyone. Inside the dome, it sang just for her. Not loud, not dramatic, just a simple line repeating like a soft breath. And for the first time in years, Tessa felt her chest loosen. She reached for Bram's hand. "This place, it's not just songs, is it?" He shook his head, smiling. "No, it's memory, feeling, all the little pieces of life that don't make noise until you stop to listen." They sat beneath the willow tree, letting the quiet music drift around them. No one else came. The world had paused again, letting them exist inside a bubble of soft sound. Bram spoke first. "My mother used to sing to me every night, but I can't remember the words." "You don't have to," Tessa said. "I think the feeling is the important part." They sat there for what felt like hours, or maybe moments. Time didn't matter here. Eventually, a soft wind rustled the leaves, and the train's whistle called in the distance. It was time to go. As they walked back toward the station, the domes pulsed gently behind them, like candles left to burn in the safety of night. Just before stepping aboard, Tessa turned back and whispered, "Thank you." A breeze curled around her, carrying a note from her melody. She caught it, tucked it into her coat, like a leaf, and smiled. Back on the train, the seats welcomed them like old friends. The carriage lights were dim, casting a warm, amber glow. Moonlight filtered through the windows in soft, silver lines. Bram leaned his head back, closing his eyes. "That was my favorite so far." "Me too," Tessa agreed. "But I feel like the next stop might be even more important." Bram nodded, eyes still closed. "We're getting closer. I can feel it." The train eased back into motion, gliding quietly through the night. Outside, the stars seemed to follow them, drifting above fields and forests, rivers and hills. Inside, their breathing slowed, hearts gently sinking with the lull of wheels on track. And ahead, somewhere in the shimmering dark, the final station waited. Not a destination, but a homecoming. The sound of the train had softened now, as though it too had grown sleepy with the night. With every gentle curve of the track, it felt less like a journey forward and more like a slow rocking into a dream. Hazel sat by the window of the lounge car, a steaming cup of chamomile tea nestled in her hands. The sky outside was velvet dark, speckled with stars that shimmered like fireflies. The moon, now low and full, seemed to ride beside the train, casting pale silver light over the gently swaying trees. She looked across the table at Mr. Thistlewood, whose hat was tipped just slightly back, his eyes closed, his breathing even. He dozed off mid-conversation somewhere between a story about a moonlit fox and a theory about why dreams linger in old railways. Hazel smiled softly. It felt right to let him rest. Everyone seemed to be resting now. She turned her eyes out to the trees again. They passed in slow motion now, as though the train no longer rushed, but glided. There was a soft chime. It was subtle, not the usual clang of bells or the click of the wheels, but something gentler, like a whisper of wind against crystal. Hazel turned. At the far end of the car stood the conductor, the same kind-eyed man with silver buttons and the softest voice. He inclined his head and beckoned. Hazel rose, leaving her tea untouched. She took care not to wake Mr. Thistlewood, whose chest rose and fell with the rhythm of someone deeply content. Her footsteps were almost soundless on the soft carpet as she followed the conductor through the next door. The car they entered was different. It was smaller, more intimate. The lighting was dim, almost like candlelight, though no candles were in sight. Plush velvet chairs lined the sides, and the windows were slightly fogged, creating a dreamlike blur of the world outside. In the center of the car stood a single door. It bore no label, no brass number, just a soft blue light that pulsed faintly around the frame. The conductor turned to her, his voice almost a breeze. "This is the last carriage," he said. "Beyond this is Evening Hollow." Hazel swallowed gently. "What's it like?" He smiled, his eyes reflecting the blue light. Different for each traveler, but always kind. She stepped forward, placing her hand on the door. The wood was warm, not from heat, but from something older and deeper, like sunlight trapped in a tree trunk or laughter sealed inside the pages of a book. The door opened soundlessly. Beyond it lay a space unlike anything she'd expected. It was not a town platform, nor a station, not even a forest path or a cobbled street. It was a meadow, gentle, wide, and bathed in the silvery breath of moonlight. Tall grass swayed in a breeze that didn't touch her skin. Fireflies danced in quiet arcs. The scent of lavender and warm earth drifted through the air, and far in the distance, just barely visible, a single lantern flickered beside a small house. Hazel stepped onto the soft earth, and the door behind her melted into the air like mist. The train was gone, or perhaps not gone, just no longer needed. She walked barefoot now, though she didn't remember removing her shoes. The ground was warm beneath her steps. The stars above pulsed slowly as though breathing in time with her. As she walked, memories began to gather. Not like a movie or a slideshow, but like mist curling around her shoulders. Soft echoes of her mother's lullaby. The feeling of warm toast on snowy mornings. Her grandfather's stories told in a rocking chair that creaked with every tale. All the little joys she thought had faded began to rise gently to the surface. By the time she reached the lantern, she realized she wasn't alone. Figures stood nearby, not strangers, but silhouettes of those she loved, those she'd lost, and those she hadn't yet met. They didn't speak. They simply were. And with them came a peace deeper than any rest she'd ever known. Hazel sat in the soft grass, the lantern flickering beside her. A cat padded up orange and round with one torn ear and a purr that rumbled like distant thunder. It curled up in her lap as though it had been waiting for her forever. She looked up. The stars above shimmered. A voice, hers yet not hers, spoke from the inside of her thoughts. "You've arrived." Back on the train, the conductor stood silently by the door. One by one, the other passengers made their way to the last carriage. Each opened the soft blue-lit door and vanished into their own quiet meadow, their own hollow. Mr. Thistlewood woke briefly, just enough to sip the last of his now lukewarm tea. He stood stretched and made his way through the train. Before entering the final door, he tipped his hat once toward the empty carriage. "Sweet dreams," he said, and stepped through. Hours passed, or perhaps none at all. Eventually, the train slowed, not with brakes or force, but like a song ending on its last note. The whistle blew once soft low like a sigh, and the engine rested under a canopy of ancient trees. No more passengers remained aboard. Inside the conductor's cabin, the small clock ticked quietly. The logs showed names, no longer legible dates that curved like vines, destinations marked simply with symbols, stars, trees, rivers, moons. The conductor hung up his cap and looked out the window. In the distance, fireflies blinked like lanterns. Somewhere in the meadow beyond, laughter echoed like wind chimes. He smiled, and then slowly faded into the air. Back in evening, hollow, Hazel sat beneath the stars. Around her, the meadow hummed with quiet life. Crickets played their soft violin songs. The wind moved like lullabies. And sleep, real deep, soul-soothing sleep, settled over her at last. Not because she was tired, but because she had arrived. Thank you for journeying with us tonight. May your dreams be gentle, your breath slow and steady, and your heart deeply at peace. Until we meet again, sleep well. The distant barking of a dog he'd once loved, the creak of the floorboards in his grandmother's hallway, the sound of rain on a canvas tent from a childhood camping trip. He stood still, closing his eyes. Each sound washed over him, not with sadness, but with softness. A gentle reassurance that nothing truly disappears, it simply changes places. The harpist plucked a final note, and the car grew still once more. "You've remembered enough for now," she said gently. "Go rest. There's more to see." Miles returned to his seat, the dream journal still in hand. He looked outside. The landscape had shifted. No longer were they passing through stars or clouds. Now there were faint outlines of hills, soft valleys, and little lights flickering like lanterns in the distance. They were approaching Evening Hollow. As the train glided forward, Miles felt the journey settling deep into his bones, not as a trip from one place to another, but as a return. A reconnection with something ancient and quiet and deeply personal. He curled up under a light blanket left folded on the seat. The train seemed to sigh with him content. Outside, the moon watched. Inside, the journal glowed faintly, writing still blooming across its pages. And Miles, dreamer, traveler, listener, closed his eyes once more. The train pressed on into the night. "I'm so glad you've joined us." Journey to a quiet seaside village where a mysterious lighthouse stands tall. A lighthouse that, as the story goes, has never once turned off its light. It shines steadily through the darkest nights and brightest dawns, always watching, always glowing like a gentle guardian of the shore. Breezes, misty mornings, and warm, flickering lanterns. It's a tale about curiosity, comfort, and the quiet magic that comes with staying awake even when the world is fast asleep. Take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, allow any tension in your body to melt away. Let the day drift behind you like footprints in the sand being washed away by the tide. The rhythm of your breathing grows slower, softer. The waves were gentle that afternoon, curling like lazy fingers against the hull of the ferry boat. Eli stood near the bow hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching the sea shift from deep blue to slate gray beneath the rolling clouds. The island had just begun to appear on the horizon, a narrow sliver of land, topped by a single shape rising above it, the lighthouse. It was taller than he remembered. The last time he had seen it was almost 15 years ago from the window of a fishing vessel headed in the opposite direction, away from the island, away from the life he no longer knew how to hold. Now, returning felt like something between dream and déjà vu. "Wind's picking up," the captain called from behind the wheelhouse, his voice easy and familiar. Eli nodded, offering a quiet smile. "Looks like rain." The captain, an old family friend, squinted toward the sky. "Maybe later. You'll make it inside before it breaks." That was the hope. And silent until they bloomed overhead without warning. Eli remembered that. He remembered many things. He tightened his scarf and turned his eyes back to the lighthouse, now clearer in the distance. It stood firm against the edge of the cliff, a solitary watcher wrapped in sea mist, white stone, rusted railings, a black lantern room at the top like a steady eye refusing to blink. It looked exactly the same and somehow impossibly different. By the time the ferry docked, the clouds had darkened and the wind carried a sharp edge. The dock creaked underfoot as Eli stepped onto the wooden planks, the wheels of his old suitcase rattling behind him. Grass and moss clung to the edges of the path that led upward toward the lighthouse. The island was still quiet. Not silent, the ocean was never truly quiet, but hushed, like it was holding its breath. To take in the view. The cliffside dropped sharply into jagged rock, the surf crashing against the base in a rhythm that had not changed in centuries. Birds wheeled above, calling softly to one another, and the lighthouse, ever still, ever watching, waited at the summit. Eli walked slowly, his boots crunching over damp gravel. As he approached the lighthouse grounds, he noticed how time had weathered the garden. The roses were overgrown, the path partly hidden by tall grass and wildflowers. A patch of lavender had grown thick around the old bench near the entrance, scenting the air with sweetness and memory. The front door was unlocked just as he'd left it. Inside, dust motes swam lazily in the filtered light. Wooden floors creaked beneath his steps. The air smelled of salt and thyme, and something faintly floral, as though the lavender had followed him inside. Narrow stairs spiraling upward, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a shelf of worn books and faded journals, and the old green armchair by the window. Eli set his suitcase down, took off his coat, and stood for a long moment, letting the quiet settle over him. The lighthouse had not been manned in over a decade. After Eli left, the island had been deemed unnecessary for official operations. The light itself had been automated, a lonely machine spinning in the dark, its patterns no longer dependent on a keeper's watch. Yet someone had kept it clean. The stove was free of ash, the shelves were tidy. A fresh stack of firewood waited neatly beside the hearth. And on the small wooden table near the chair was a mug, ceramic, glazed blue, empty, but clean. Eli touched the rim with his fingers. Caretaker, a wanderer, or was this lighthouse, this strange old place, simply keeping itself? As twilight settled in, Eli lit a lamp and began to unpack. His notebook, a small tin of tea, a wool blanket he'd always used here, items that made the unfamiliar space feel like home again. Outside, the sea turned black. The lighthouse light spun slowly above, casting its rhythmic glow over the water. Every few seconds, it would sweep across the windows, throwing long shadows that drifted along the walls, like ghosts remembering how to dance. He brewed tea and stood at the window watching the stars blink into view. The island, for all its distance from the world, had always offered the clearest skies. No city lights, no traffic. Only the wind, the waves, and the light. He sipped slowly. The tea warmed him, grounding him. He didn't feel alone. And yet he was. After unpacking and tidying, Eli climbed the spiral stairs to the top of the tower. They creaked beneath his weight, but held firm. At the top, the lantern room was just as he'd imagined it. Wide glass panes, a metal railing circling the outside, and the great lens in the center turning steadily. He watched it for a while, mesmerized by its slow, eternal rhythm. The sea beyond stretched forever. From here, he could see the ferry dock, the overgrown path, the cliffs that had once felt like boundaries to a smaller version of himself. Below, the keeper's quarters glowed with warm lamplight. The wind tugged at the tower's windows, whispering through old cracks and seams. Eli closed his eyes and leaned against the railing. He remembered long nights spent up here, storms howling outside, while he kept the logs updated. making sure the light stayed steady. He had been young then, serious, hopeful, tired, but not now. Now he felt that the island had waited for him. Not just the structure, but the land, the light, the air. As though his absence had been noticed, as though his return mattered. When he returned downstairs, it was well into night. He opened a journal, one he hadn't written in for years, and sat at the desk near the window. The pen felt natural in his hand. Outside, the light swept again across the cliffs. He began to write, not facts, not weather, not reports or logs, but memories. The sound of his mother humming in the kitchen before a storm. The taste of blackberry pie from the village down the coast. The first time he saw the northern lights from this very tower streaking the sky like paint across canvas. He wrote until the candle burned low and his eyes began to blur. Then, with a slow stretch and a deep breath, he curled into the armchair, wrapped the blanket around his legs, and listened to the wind. Hush of a lighthouse alive in the night. And just as sleep reached for him, he heard something else. A soft, distant meow. At first, he thought he imagined it. But there it was, again, a gentle, plaintive sound just beyond the door. Eli rose cautious and opened it. A small gray cat sat on the steps, blinking up at him with bright green eyes. She looked dry clean and entirely unbothered by the cold. "Hello," Eli said softly. The cat meowed again and padded inside tail high as though returning to her rightful place. She circled the armchair once, then leapt lightly into it, curling into a tight ball and purring. Eli laughed. The sound felt strange, like a forgotten note, and gently scratched behind her ears. He didn't ask where she'd come from. He didn't need to. The lighthouse never slept, and now neither did he not in the way he once had. Let the steady spin of the light rock him like a cradle, and finally drifted off the soft purr of the island, rising like a lullaby. The evening came gently, as if the sky itself had decided to whisper instead of speak. A cool blue haze settled across the island, stretching out into the sea like a soft blanket. Eli stood at the top of the lighthouse tower, gazing out over the stillness. The horizon shimmered faintly in the fading light, and for a moment it felt as if the edge of the world had moved just a little closer. Down below, the sea lapped at the rocks with patient rhythm. The air was cooler now. Moon, his ever-loyal cat, curled around his feet, tail flicking contentedly. She never meowed, not loudly anyway. She just existed like she'd always been there, like the island itself. Eli's evening routines were usually the same. Light the lamp, check the mechanisms, boil water for tea, write notes in the logbook. But expectant, as though the island was holding its breath. After lighting the lamp, he descended the winding stairs with slow, familiar steps. Each board creaked in the same places it always had. But this time the sounds felt deeper, like echoes of something older than he was, maybe even older than the lighthouse. The kitchen welcomed him with the scent of dried herbs, chamomile, lavender, mint. A little bundle hung near the stove, gently swaying in the breeze that crept through a cracked window. He set the kettle on and leaned against the wooden counter, watching as Moon leapt onto the table and settled herself into a loaf-like shape. Steam began to curl upward from the spout, hissing softly. Eli poured himself a cup and sat in the chair by the window. The night outside was full and deep, no stars just yet, just a soft darkness slowly thickening. And in that quiet, a memory surfaced. Not sharp, more like fog. Years ago, a voice, not his asking, "Why does the lighthouse shine when no one is near?" He hadn't answered then. He still didn't know how. He took a sip of tea. It tasted richer tonight, almost sweet, though he hadn't added honey. Maybe the herbs had aged, or maybe something else lingered in the air. Then, out of nowhere, a sound, a low, drawn-out hum, not mechanical, not wind. It was almost musical, like the hum of a cello under someone's breath. Eli stood slowly, placing his cup down. Moon remained still, ears perked, but unafraid. The sound was coming from outside, not the shore, not the sky. It came from the cliffs just beyond the garden, the place where no paths led, where the ground gave way to jagged rock and wind-carved stone. He pulled on his coat, took a lantern, and opened the door. The breeze greeted him with a salt-laced kiss. Moon stayed inside, blinking slowly at him, as if to say, "You go. I'll stay warm." Yet the night gave it a different face. The lantern cast a golden circle around his feet, shadows dancing just beyond the edge. The humming continued a little louder now, and layered like more than one tone overlapping. It was strange, not unpleasant, just otherworldly. He followed the sound, passing the edge of his usual garden, stepping over weathered stones and old driftwood. The cliffs loomed ahead, their surfaces glistening slightly under the moonlight which had now begun to filter through the thinning clouds. And there at the edge where no one ever stood, someone was standing. Eli froze. A figure, tall, motionless, cloaked in something that looked like sea foam and shadow. He gripped the lantern tighter. "Hello." His voice was a whisper against the wind. The figure didn't turn. It simply lifted a hand pointing toward the sea, and then, without warning, the humming stopped. Silence crashed in like a wave. Only the sound of the sea returned, only the cliffs, only him. He stepped forward cautiously, holding the lantern out. Nothing, no footprints, no indentations, not even dampness where someone might have stood. And yet, he didn't feel alone. A whisper stirred in the back of his mind, not language, but feeling, like the memory of someone calling your name in a dream. He stood there for a long moment, watching the horizon. The stars had begun to appear now, scattered like old stories across the sky. The lighthouse beam swept gently behind him, casting his shadow long and flickering across the rocks. Eventually, he turned back. The path home felt longer this time, the air colder, but not unkind. Just contemplative. Back inside, Moon was asleep on the cushion by the hearth. He placed the lantern on the table and hung up his coat, pausing for a moment as he noticed something strange. The front of the coat damp, not from sea spray. He touched the spot and felt peace. He sat again by the window. The tea had gone cold, but he didn't mind. Outside, the lighthouse turned again and again, sweeping the sea with light, and far in the distance beyond the mist, something flickered in return. He slept that night, not in his bed, but in the chair by the window. Moon curled into his lap. Dreams came slowly, like waves lapping a quiet beach. He dreamed of ships with no names, sailing under skies with no stars. He dreamed of a voice saying thank you. He dreamed of the island breathing as if alive, and the lighthouse not just guiding sailors, but remembering them. When morning came, he awoke with the certainty of something unspoken. The sea had changed, the wind had shifted, and he was beginning to remember. The sky hung heavy with clouds, a soft gray curtain pulled across the stars. Sipping his tea, slowly watching the mist roll in across the sea. It came in waves, thick and deliberate, swallowing the world one tree, one rock, one wave at a time. Moon, the cat, lay curled by his feet, her eyes half closed, but still alert. The light above turned steadily, its long beam cutting through the haze in slow, rhythmic sweeps. Eli listened to the hum of the machinery overhead, the low rumble grounding him in the present moment. But something tonight felt different, not dangerous, not quite strange. just different. It began with a sound soft at first, barely audible over the wind and sea. It was a voice, not sharp or clear, but melodic and distant, like a song hummed through a wall. Eli set his teacup down carefully and stood. Moon lifted her head, but didn't move. She too seemed to be listening. He stepped outside the cool night air brushing against his skin, damp with the moisture of the fog. But in tone, it was mournful, almost lullaby-like, a call from somewhere just beyond the cliff's edge. The path down to the water was slick but familiar. Eli had walked it countless times, yet tonight it felt like walking into a dream. The air was so thick with mist that even the beam of the lighthouse couldn't penetrate more than a few feet ahead. Still, the voice called, and Eli followed. He moved slowly, one hand brushing along the low stone wall that bordered the path. As he reached the edge where the cliff dropped steeply to the rocks below, the voice ceased. Silence. Then, barely more than a whisper, he heard his name. Eli. He froze. Not out of fear, out of recognition. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years, a voice that belonged to someone long gone. He turned expecting to see only fog, and he did. But then the mist shifted. Shapes emerged not clearly, but like memories returning in fragments. Not solid, not ghostly, something in between. She wore a shawl, sea-worn and old, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were soft, kind, and deeply familiar. Clara Eli whispered. The figure didn't speak, but she smiled. It wasn't possible. Clara had died years ago, before Eli ever came to the lighthouse. He'd read about her in the old journals, one of the original keepers who had vanished during a storm. Yet here she stood, not lost, not gone, just waiting. She reached out a hand. Eli stepped forward, unsure whether he was dreaming or truly awake. As his fingers neared hers, she faded like steam rising off water, dissipating into the fog. He stood there a long time listening, hoping the voice would return. It didn't. But something lingered. A feeling, a peace. Like an answer had been given, though no question had been asked. He walked back slowly, the fog curling around his legs, thick but gentle. Again and again, guiding him like a heartbeat in the dark. When he returned to the lighthouse, Moon was waiting by the door-tail, flicking gently. Inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed him back. But the world felt different now, as though the island had shifted slightly, not physically, but in meaning. He sat once more by the window, tea still warm in the cup, and stared out into the endless gray. The voice didn't return that night, but Eli no longer needed it to, because he remembered now. The story of Clara, the loneliness she must have felt, the way the sea can hold you, keep you until time forgets your name. He picked up his notebook and began to write not just weather notes or keeper logs. He wrote Clara's name and her story, or at least the parts he knew. Maybe he thought that's what the voice had come for, not to haunt, but to be remembered. Hours passed. It felt suffocating. It was soft now, like a blanket wrapping the island in slumber. Eli dozed in his chair, Moon purring softly beside him. And in his dream, he walked again to the cliff's edge, not alone, but hand in hand with someone who had waited too long in silence. They stood together in the mist, and this time when the wind called his name, he smiled, because he knew the island was not haunted. It was simply full of memories that needed space to breathe. The night deepened around the island, and the stars above pulsed like quiet heartbeats. The lighthouse lantern continued its slow, steady sweep across the sea, casting soft halos into the misty darkness. Eli sat near the window, the ancient leather-bound notebook still open on his lap. Moon lay curled at his feet, twitching gently in sleep, perhaps chasing dream birds or waves. filled with quiet magic memories that were his, yet carried the voice of the island too. There was something deeply comforting in knowing that even in his solitude, something or someone had been listening all along. He closed the book gently and walked to the lighthouse's spiral stair, drawn upward by a sense he couldn't quite name. As he ascended, the air grew cooler, crisper. The stone walls, worn smooth from decades of footsteps, felt alive beneath his touch. At the top, he pushed open the rust-kissed door to the lantern room. The light was calm now, no longer frantic or flickering like it had been on the strange night of the fog. It rotated with an almost meditative rhythm, throwing golden light far across the inky blackness. Through the glass panes, the ocean looked like a sleeping creature breathing slowly, endlessly. Eli stepped closer to the edge, resting his hand on the railing, pierced only by the occasional distant call of a night bird. He had spent so many nights up here, but tonight felt fuller, as though the light no longer just warned ships away but reached outward in welcome. From the base of the tower, a low rumble echoed up the stairwell, not threatening, more like a distant voice trying to speak. Moon stirred downstairs and meowed once quietly. Eli didn't hesitate. He descended the stairs, each footstep deliberate, his senses attuned. When he reached the base, the sound became clearer, not quite words, but vibrations, memories stirring deep beneath the stone floor. He moved toward the cellar, the oldest part of the lighthouse rarely visited except for maintenance. The air down there always felt colder, like time had settled and never moved again. He unlocked the thick wooden door and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he remembered: stone walls, wooden beams, shelves stacked with old supplies. In the far corner, behind a stack of long-forgotten crates, a soft glow pulsed from the floor. Eli moved toward it, heart calm, breath steady. There was a trap door, one he'd never noticed in all his years here. The edges were perfectly flush, with the floor hidden unless you knew just where to look. He hesitated only a moment before lifting it open. Below, stone steps led downward, disappearing into a tunnel lit by faint blue-green light. It didn't feel eerie. It felt sacred, like the island had saved this part of itself for when he was ready. He descended each step, soft and deliberate. The air grew warmer, fragrant with salt and lavender, strangely reminiscent of his mother's old garden. The tunnel opened into a small underground chamber carved directly into the bedrock, and in the center stood a pool of still water glowing faintly with light from beneath. Eli stepped forward and peered into the water. It was not just a pool, it was a mirror. Long gone. He saw a younger version of himself, standing on the cliff, eyes wide with wonder. He saw the storm that had taken his father's ship the moment he vowed to become the island's keeper. He saw himself dancing clumsily with a girl on the summer porch, laughter like music. And he saw the present moment, standing in this sacred place, the island watching him back. A voice, not with words but with emotion, filled the room. "You have kept the light. Now let it keep you." Eli blinked slowly, a tear slipping down one cheek. He wasn't afraid. He felt found, whole. He sat by the pool for a long while, breathing in the memory-rich air. Eventually, the glow faded, and the pool stilled its surface, now reflecting only the rock above. But the warmth remained in his chest. He climbed the stairs again and closed the trapdoor behind him. Back in the main room, Moon was awake, staring at him with those ever-knowing eyes. That night, he wrote again in his own notebook, not to record, but to remember. There is a place beneath the light. It knows my name. It showed me who I was and who I have always been. The island is alive with memory, and now I carry its stories as my own. He placed the notebook beside the hearth, then returned to the window. The sea had calmed completely now, like glass touched by moonlight. He whispered, "Thank you," and for the first time in decades, Eli felt not like a keeper watching the world, but a part of the world that had finally been seen. The light that filtered in wasn't just morning light, it was something more. It carried with it the sense of closure of something sacred having quietly come to an end, or maybe a beginning. Eli stood slowly, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. His joints ached, but the ache was not unpleasant. It was the ache of deep sleep, of restoration. Sat and placed a hand gently on her back. She leaned into it for a moment, then turned her gaze toward the horizon again, tail flicking once in quiet contentment. Outside, the sky opened fully. Clouds had scattered during the night, and the world now gleamed with that special stillness only early mornings held. The lighthouse's lantern glass, for the first time in Eli's memory, did not catch the sun's rays with its usual shine. The light inside it had gone out in the night, and yet the world had not fallen into chaos. The sea had not swallowed the island. The sky had not darkened. Instead, the island looked peaceful. A kettle whistled softly in the kitchen, though Eli didn't remember putting it on. He walked over and lifted it off the flame. The stove glowed warm, familiar. He reached for his mug, the chipped one with a faded gull printed on the side, and poured himself a cup of tea, chamomile by the scent. Call selecting it. Everything felt a bit like a dream now, but not the kind that disappears when you blink. This dream clung gently to the edges of things, the way steam curled off the tea, the hum of the wooden floor beneath his feet, the steady rhythm of Moon's purr now returned to her place beside the fireplace. He sat down at the small table near the window and looked out toward the sea. The tide was low, revealing the darkened stretch of rocks and seaweed that usually lay hidden beneath the waves. Gulls wheeled above, crying out in a language older than memory. Eli watched them drift and dive their wings, carving quiet arcs in the sky. For once, there was no pressing need to record the height of the waves or the visibility. No need to log the wind's direction. It was all simply happening. The lighthouse was no longer just his responsibility. It had spoken in its way. Through the fog, the dreams, the voice in the book. Doing so allowed Eli to do the same. He thought back to the stories written in his notebook, the memories that had returned like gentle echoes. Perhaps the island had always remembered for him. Perhaps he was never as alone as he had thought. He took a sip of tea, then he heard it again. Not the voice from before, not the one from the fog or the book, but a different sound. A knock. 3 soft taps at the door. Eli blinked. Visitors were rare, almost impossible actually. The ferry only came once a week, and it wasn't scheduled today. And even then, no one ever came up the hill unless it was an emergency. Still, he stood and made his way to the door. He opened it slowly. Standing there was a young woman. She wore a long coat, dark blue with brass buttons, and a wide-brimmed hat with salt-flecked fabric. Her boots were caked in sand and seaweed. Slung over one shoulder was a satchel, weathered but sturdy. Startlingly familiar, not because he'd seen her before, but because they held the same quiet knowing as the sea. "Hello," she said. Her voice was soft, yet clear. "I hope I'm not too early." Eli blinked. Early for what? She smiled and stepped inside as if she'd done it 100 times. For the changeover. He stared at her. What? She removed her hat and set it gently on the hook by the door. Her hair spilled out dark with strands of silver already threading through like moonlight in ink. "The lighthouse," she said. "It's ready to rest now, and so are you." Eli looked around, unsure whether this was another vision or dream, but everything felt so real. The warmth of the tea in his hand, the soft thud of Moon hopping down to inspect the stranger. The woman crouched to pet the cat. "You must be Moon. I've read about you." She doesn't usually, Eli started to say, but stopped. Was purring deeply. "You read about her?" he asked. The woman nodded. "In the journal. Your stories. I've been reading them for a long time. They're beautiful." Eli's throat tightened. "You're the next keeper," he said, finally understanding. She gave a small nod. "If the lighthouse is ready." He looked past her to the sea. The tower loomed behind them, not as a burden, but as a companion, a guardian, a friend. And for the first time, it didn't feel like his weight to carry anymore. "I suppose it is," he whispered. The woman stood. "Then maybe you'll stay a little while longer. Show me the ropes." Eli smiled. "Of course, there's no rush." And for the rest of that morning, he walked her through every part of the lighthouse, the tools, the journal, the lantern mechanism, even the garden and the trail down to the shoreline. He told her stories too, some that had come back to him recently, and others he thought he'd forgotten. With urgency, but with reverence. By afternoon, the air had grown warm. A soft breeze played across the hilltop. The sea sparkled like it had secrets to keep. They sat together by the cliff's edge, sipping tea and watching the tide return. Moon curled between them, utterly at ease. "I don't know your name," Eli said after a while. The woman looked out over the water and said, "It doesn't matter much here, but you can call me Claire." "Claire," he repeated, tasting the name. She smiled. "I think," she said, "this lighthouse has always watched and listened, and it remembers everyone who has kept it company. I hope it remembers me kindly." Claire looked at him. "It already does." The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of peach and lilac. The lighthouse light blinked once, then again, not in warning, but in greeting, as if saying goodbye and thank you and welcome all at once. Lighthouse. He walked down the trail past the garden, past the stones he'd once arranged in quiet moments of reflection. He made his way to a small cabin tucked in the trees, one he'd built long ago, back when he thought he might need a place to retreat. He'd never used it much, but tonight it felt like home. As he lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind sigh through the pines, he felt no sadness, no loss, only peace. The lighthouse would shine again, but under new eyes with new stories to hear, and he would rest, not because he had given up, but because he had given enough. And now, in the quiet hush of twilight, the island itself seemed to breathe deeply and smile. And so, dear traveler, the lighthouse stands, its light still turning, its heart still listening. But the keeper has passed the flame on, not out of weariness, but of knowing when it is time to rest. Ended with love will continue to grow in other hands. The island remembers, and perhaps so will you. As your eyes grow heavier and the quiet night wraps around you like a warm blanket, let this story drift with you into your dreams. Let the waves carry you gently. Let the light guide you wherever you are. Thank you for keeping watch with us tonight. Sleep well, and until next time,